Omar Kholeif in conversation with James Bridle. James is a London-based artist and writer on technology and culture. In fact, he collaborated with Omar on one of Omar's latest books, You Are Here, Art After the Internet. Excellent essay. Omar is a curator at the Whitechapel Gallery, but more relevant, he is today the Abraj Group Art Prize guest curator for 2015. They will be discussing how human intentions shape technology and in turn the world around us in this illustrated conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sultan, and to everyone here at Art Dubai and the Global Art Forum for letting me have this conversation with James Bridle, who is enjoying his first trip to the GCC these days. And I'm very curious to hear what he thinks and what other things, what other fantastical conversations might emerge from the visual topography of Dubai and beyond. This is an illustrated conversation, we called it, but actually it's really just me doing what Schumann says sometimes, playing opera to James, who is the star of this conversation. As Sultan mentioned, James is an artist, writer, and publisher and technologist, among many other things. But really, I see all of those elements really forming part of an art practice that seeks to question how systems and structures of power or institutions are governed, and really what occurs is through a process of making visible different mechanisms or visualizing them, mechanisms that utilize or instrumentalize technology. He opens up possibilities and readings about the world around us, which is a very exciting thing. In 2011, he coined the term the New Aesthetic, which began as a Tumblr blog, I believe. And his research on the topic and the matter has since been featured and distributed worldwide and been the subject of much debate. As well as being an artist, he also holds a master in computer and cognitive science with a focus on artificial intelligence. So he really is the brains of this pairing up here. And I guess really the idea behind this conversation was to think about the visualizing of technologies, of the digital sphere, of the internet, the blurring of the real and virtual world, and to think about what looking at technologies and unpicking them might reveal about the world around us. But before we kind of begin, I thought it would be ideal to kind of start with the we're going to talk through a whole range of works and slides and images together and pose all sorts of questions, and there'll be room for you to kind of interject at the end. But really, I thought what would be really ideal is to start off by asking James to give us a synopsis or a brief understanding of what the New Aesthetic was meant to be, what it is, and what it has become, and what it may be in the future.
Sure, and thank you. Thank you. Yeah, can I put those up? Thank you. Ace. Most of these images are just kind of backdrop. So as Omar said, the New Aesthetic is a weird thing. It was a silly idea that got possibly out of hand. But one of those silly ideas that you realize is clearly sort of necessary in the world somehow, because it became many things for many people. People needed a terminology for this. What it started with for me was kind of boredom and disappointment with the way that we talked about the world as I felt most other people saw it, which was something that was heavily mediated through technology, and where in fact we'd ceased to even be able to identify the boundaries of where those things happened. And yet we lacked a way of talking meaningfully about that. And that lack of being able to talk, it was also evident in the imagery that we called up. This particularly weird image I always use as a totem. It's just a satellite image that I saw in the newspaper. It's a satellite image of irrigation fields in southern Africa. But it looks like pixels. To me, undoubtedly, and to everyone else I see it, you see something of pixelation, of computation, of digitization within this image, even though it's an entirely physical image. There's something we have become accustomed to as humans, seeing through the lens of the digital. And of course, this is also, while I say it's a real thing, entirely composited image. And we might come back to satellite composition in a minute. But this has been taken by a multispectral sensor aboard a satellite in low Earth orbit, and then transmitted through endless computational networks in order to reach us. It's been, turned into a digital file of ones and zeros. It's then been reanimated on various screens all over the place. Like, there's so much depth to this image, it's ridiculous. And yet we struggle to talk about that all the time. Once you start noticing stuff like that, you just start noticing these deeply strange effects in image culture that to me always reveals a kind of far deeper complexity. So whether it's the kind of popularity of simple things like image filters, which feel to me like everyone goes, oh, it's kind of this kind of instant nostalgia. And for me, there's something far deeper to this than simply nostalgia. It's an attempt to adapt our psychology and our physicality to the realities of image sharing, for example. And a kind of instant memorialization that engraves the importance of this stuff. For me, sharing has kind of come to almost replace memory in many forms. That's what's happening when we release all these images. People say, oh, you take so many images, you'll never look back. I don't need to look back again. I've like stored them in deep storage by sharing them, by kind of putting them out there. All these kind of, the fact that huge amounts of this imagery is produced out in the world. That the far more of it is gathered increasingly by devices and machines that see the world fundamentally differently to humans do, and yet we act on those images and we live alongside them all the time. That living alongside I thought was really interesting in Troy's conversation earlier, because he used the exact same image I used of Kasparov losing to Deep Blue, which is this incredibly powerful image of Kasparov with his head in his hands. It's like, it's when the humans lost, right? In one sense. Like, we solved computer chess, it's like done. Except chess is really interesting these days because they play something called centaur chess, which is grandmasters using computers and playing against each other. Because it turns out that like even like your phone will whip a grandmaster these days. But a grandmaster plus a computer will whip, a grandmaster with a rubbish computer will whip a really, really good computer. So this possibility of working with the technology rather than having an oppositional relationship to it is foundational. And finally on that, just to say, one of the ways I figured this is by looking at the physical infrastructure of the internet. The reason there's an aesthetic in the title of this half-baked theory is because ultimately we have to get to this stuff by looking at it. We have to be able to see it, touch it, feel it, because we're still like dumb lizards in our brains. And that's what we need to be able to grasp onto. So I'm obsessed with the internet as, this is a bit of the internet, basically, a massive data center in London. These are scattered all over the place. But when you start to see the internet as an architecture and as an infrastructure, you start to see it as something that doesn't like exist somewhere off in some magical cloud land, but something that exists and permeates everywhere, that exists in your pockets and in legal jurisdictions and so on and so forth. And as soon as you start to see the images, then you start to see how things are actually put together and who's putting them together underneath. Is that a good enough intro?
It's a very good intro. He speaks faster than me, which makes me feel very impressed. I'm getting all your tweets, people. I think there's tweets coming in already, James. So, on that note, the New Aesthetic began as a Tumblr blog. You were posting reflections about this online, and very quickly you developed a following. And it was, I would say, interpreted and embraced by different people, but also appropriated. We've talked quite a bit about the obsession with newness, and I would like to just talk a little bit about the two different ways that the new aesthetic was kind of incorporated into two different fields. One perhaps the more commercial field, and one the artistic field, and how those two differed.
Yeah, there was like lots of what does the new aesthetic mean for fashion, or like whose collection at whatever thing is the most new aesthetic this year, or the kind of really deeply odd stuff like this that, like as I said, it just gave this kind of umbrella term to that people needed to have something to glom onto around the kind of collision interference of physical and digital as we then and still slightly understand it. But moreover, I think, was the fact that it's sort of, in the method of doing it as well, it's sort of internet ready. It started as blogging and on Tumblr and in various other places. And it started also as a writing project, as a creative project that took place within the medium of the internet itself. And I think that's kind of crucial. The New Aesthetic was always an attempt to write in the form that the internet wanted, essentially, in order to understand what the internet is. Or actually, I'd prefer to talk about the network, by which I mean like the internet and us, the entire kind of system of it. Like, what does the network want? What is it for? And one way to do that is to make work in it and through it, and watch what happens to that, and kind of reveal the form that comes to. So yeah, it's appropriated all over the place. Like it's two words that together or even separately could mean almost anything. So why not take it and apply it to all this kind of stuff? It was never meant to be a movement or a thing. It was just like, here's a thing, go, run, talk about this thing.
Well, it was called by some a movement without a prophet or something like that somewhere.
It's certainly that, yeah.
But it's worth unpicking this idea of new aesthetic, which was in a way to kind of think about a field of visual culture as a useful thing to kind of just talk about this idea of your position about how we as individuals should understand the language of the digital sphere. And you've often been quite proactive in suggesting that the language of programming, the language of coding, the language that informs the visual culture and the compositions that we see is one that should be known by basically everybody. And my reading and interpretation of that is that through the understanding of that language, one is able to make their own assumptions and own deductions about what system it is that they are functioning or operating within. Can you talk a bit more about that as an idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one thing you always hear about the internet, which I think is rubbish, which is that everything is getting faster and everything is more complicated now, and oh my goodness, how could we all possibly keep up with everything that's going on? How can you know everything? Blah. Everybody in all of history has always thought that. And we kind of know that, and we say it glibly, like, oh yeah, everyone's always thought it's going fast. But they really, really have. Like, it's not a made-up thing. It's a fact of being alive that the world feels complicated. What I'm interested in is the fact that throughout the history of technologies, of kind of mass technologies, particularly of communication technologies, those technologies have been technologies of making sense. And I'd put art actually into that bracket as not like different from technology in that fact. They've been attempts to make sense of that complexity. The internet feels like the biggest thing we've built so far to do that. And if you're asking like, what is it for? Then it's for understanding the world, right? It's given to us in order to a new form of sense making. I used to spend a lot of time trying to think of better metaphors for the internet. Better metaphors, the cloud, for example. Now I mostly think about like, what in the world is the internet a good metaphor for? Because you actually start to see network-like structures everywhere. And the joy of that, and what makes it different and interesting, is the fact that it is actually more widely accessible than many previous technologies in many forms of ways. Like fundamentally, there's all kinds of roadblocks being put on that path, and there's all kinds of difficulties with that, and power structures completely immanent within it. But like fundamentally, its job is to like share that information with everyone, which makes it new and exciting. And so how do you come to that understanding? I'm biased because I studied computer science and because I program computers really badly, but I basically fundamentally understand the principles behind doing that. That turns out to be a fantastic way of teaching about systems thinking, essentially, about how to think about large systems, because the process of computer science is essentially how you break things down logically into smaller and smaller pieces. And if you understand that, you start to see that as a pattern across the world, across all stratas of kind of society and the way that we function as humans. And that suddenly becomes like magically visible to you when you understand a certain way of looking at the world that computer science teaches you. I think there probably are other ways of teaching that as well. I think some video games have evolved kind of along the same timeline in response to the same stimuli in culture as a way of teaching us about complex systems. And I think people are being trained through those kind of ways. But if you want to teach it kind of educationally in schools, then I think teaching how computers work, and then from there, like how the internet works, how it works at every step, what engineers call the full stack, is a fundamentally like political training in how to see the world. So I think that kind of education is hugely important.
You talk about this idea of essentially you're also learning by doing, in a sense, and actually it's a very nice segue into a project of yours called the Rainbow Plane, I think, to think about this idea of this phenomenon and how it enables you, how this enabled this practice, and actually how the practice in itself reflects on or opens up the language of technology. I don't know if we could shift to the next slide, but this was an image, I believe this is a Google image of a first case, a Google image of a plane that looked like a rainbow, but actually what I later found out from you was that this was a kind of real-world glitch, as it were, because this is kind of how a satellite sees different planes. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, if you go around Google Maps or any other publicly available digital mapping setups are available, you will see in satellite imagery, particularly near airports where they're flying at the right altitude, you'll see images like this. And you occasionally see it on cars on the highway if they're moving really fast, because it's an effect that's produced by speed. Because, as I mentioned earlier, satellites don't have cameras on them, they have sensors. So they're not seeing purely in the visual spectrum, and they're not really seeing at all. They're recording radio waves, electromagnetic radiation. Some of that's the visible spectrum, some of it's like way up in the ultraviolet and in the infrared. And they see the spectra differently. And so if something's moving very fast, they record those spectra separately. And you get this extension through time. But it was only through, I'd been looking at these images for ages, seeing these rainbows, without having any idea about any of that. But knowing that a glitch is always like a key to seeing a system. I don't want to aestheticize the glitch itself, but it as a doorway into which you can see the underlying system functioning, because it's a mistake in that kind of function, and so that begins a kind of process of reverse engineering, which I think was kind of Lawrence's thing about reverse engineering, that the speech voice lie analysis system he showed us just before. That process of reverse engineering is like one of the kind of primary qualities of much of this kind of work, I think, of taking these systems and digging into them in order to find out, like, to understand how they function.
Well, one of the ways that you've done that is by embodying things such as the rainbow plane. This was for the Future Generation Art Prize in Ukraine. This image. Can you tell us about this particular visualization, because it was a very particular plane, wasn't it, that you were...
Well, in part it was the plane that would fit inside this slightly odd shopping centre in Kiev, but it was also very specifically a Gulfstream jet, because I'm very interested in the networks and affordances of private aviation, essentially. In other projects, I've spent a lot of time looking at where planes go, essentially, whose planes are they and why, but also very specifically, like, who has access to that information. My favorite website is one of those, like, plane tracking websites where anyone in the world can call up and see all of the planes that are going on. That's, like digital mapping itself, a godlike power, right, that now resides in our pockets. Something really quite an extraordinary access to information that's made possible through these domesticated network technologies. But also, for me, there is again something akin to in the use of private jets. It's a privileged usage of technology, right? It allows a freedom of movement around the world that's available only to a kind of select few. That's akin to the privileged view of kind of technology itself, or privileged understanding of technology, or the privileged use of that technology. The fact that people who do understand how satellites function have a particular view on the world and a particular agency in the world. And I think that's what a lot of this comes down to in terms of when we talk about, like, why this is important to understand, why for me an understanding of technology is important, is because it increases your agency in the world. And an agency, without agency you cannot function. And for me, if you do not understand the fabric of the world around you, like how it's actually functioning, then you lack all agency within it, and you can't act fully. So the only way to kind of gain that kind of agency is to understand the functioning of these systems, and also understand, by doing that, the kind of biases and prejudices that are inherent in them, and perhaps overcome them as well.
You've said about this work that, in a way, it's about how technology sees the world, and also how it can reveal, how the aesthetics of that technology can reveal different kinds of depths. In particular, can you talk us through, I suppose, how you formally imagine these things and the decision that you take in each context? Because you're gonna show us a few other works as well. But what is it for you? Is it about trying to replicate that aesthetic, or to critique the aesthetic of technology, or to put it in conversation with a different kind of aesthetic?
I think I wouldn't say it's not any of those things. Essentially, for me, it's like I'm driven by a curiosity simply to understand those things, and second that, a desire to like communicate that understanding to anybody who will listen to me, because I think essentially that it's super fascinating and may actually help in some degrees. And then you just come to a simple question of form of like how you put this into a world that will in a way that will travel. And I think for me a lot of that understanding also comes from the like thinking about the network itself. Like the new aesthetic itself was a kind of network-driven phenomena. The form that the work may take in this and in the drone shadows, which we might see later, is also like a massive physical installation designed entirely to be photographed and put on the internet, right? And that's really, really key to this this kind of stuff. Like I didn't really always realize, or it took me a while to realize that was what was happening. But I'm always hugely aware that like these are part of a far larger network-driven image culture that. And I'm more interested in them going out. It's awesome when you can come and see these things, when I get to see them, like done for real in front of you. But their primary area of operation is going to be online, because that's where I want to communicate and talk about these things.
I think it's a good time actually to talk about Drone Shadow in particular, because, which is a project that I think we have a slide of in a second here. These are visualizations of drone shadows in different places, and for me, your work is very much about embodying that, or revealing those things that may be invisible, but also actually trying to encourage us to think about our physical relationship to those things. Can you talk a bit about the genesis of that project and actually how you were able to understand or see those very particular shadows in those contexts?
Yeah, I mean, the project comes out of being fascinated by the figure of the drone itself, but also being incredibly critical of my own fascination with it, in that they're easy things to glamorize and get excited about. They are basically flying death robots, and that has a dark kind of sci-fi glamour to them that you can get over-involved in. And so I was fascinated with them, but wanted to be very careful about my own fascination with it, and not to pull out that glamour of them, to really see why I thought there was something particularly fascinating about these things. And as soon as you start to do that, you realize how little you know about such things. And the genesis, they did a number of drone projects, and the drone shadows in particular came out of this feeling that like I would never stand in front of one of them. I was never gonna like stand in front of it and touch it and measure myself physically against this object. And there was something kind of extraordinary to me about that, and how distanced I felt from it by not being able to do that. And so in conversation with my friend Einar, who you can see in the slide, we were talking about this, and we were just like, well, let's just sketch it out and work out exactly how big it was. And so we sketched out one of them. This is a predator, and we immediately several things became clear. Which first of all was just like, whoa, it's massive, which like is still the stock first response of almost everyone who sees the drone shadows. But the second one was like this quality of invisibility that it has, even now, as just this kind of spectral outline, is absolutely central to its existence, and that far beyond that, the object of the drone itself is like its least significant quality. Its most significant quality is that it is an avatar of the network itself. That it is this kind of like just single point manifestation of an incredibly complex system. A system that prefers invisibility. Yeah, I might say a bit more to that.
Well, your fascination or interest in drones, it's difficult to find the appropriate terminology when we're talking about flying deaf robots. Also extends to another project called Dronestagram as well, which is an aggregator of different deaths that occurred by drones in different contexts, and it's these abstracted aerial images that you often see loaded to this Tumblr, isn't it? It's a Tumblr? Instagram Tumblr. It's an Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter. So did this project precede the other one, or were they done simultaneously?
No, this comes after.
This one comes after. So how did this particular project emerge? Did you use an algorithm to gather this information, or was it information that you had pulled together? Can you talk us through that?
No, the basis to this is very much human. In that I work with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, or at least I rely on their very good work, which is an independent journalism organization that does a bunch of investigations, one of which is tracking covert drone strikes, so drone strikes that occur outside declared theaters of war, i.e. secret wars, essentially. But the intervention that I'm more making in this is that what was interesting to me about this vast conflict is that it almost entirely lacked imagery. that you could read, these reports of events occurring that were gathered under huge duress, effectively collated from eyewitness reports, not reported in wide media circles. You had to really go looking for this information, but it was still just this text. It was still just the record of the thing happening. And yet, and that's unusual because we're used to seeing incredibly mediatized, televised images of warfare. But not only that, there was the fact that that we have spent the last 10, 20 years building, like I said, another of these godlike powers where any of us can take out our phones and see the entire Earth through the eyes of satellites, right? That you have this incredible purview of the world. And so when I said that the drone shadows were, like emanations of a network, it's emanations of all that network. The drone war and our everyday civilian applications, they run on the same substrate. They're products of exactly the same forms of technology or the same understanding of technology. So while the technology networks that run contemporary wars are tuned towards secrecy and obscuration, the social media that we use is tuned towards visibility and sharing and publicity, but they're essentially performing the same function. And so this was a project about closing the loops between those different forms the network had by using the social media to return imagery to this kind of closed network.
And with a project that you did last summer in Bold Tendencies on the roof of a Peckham car park, you kind of actually, using a giant balloon, which I later found out was one that's used often in military operations, you actually intervened in that context. And what looks like, I think it looks quite innocent and friendly, this balloon, but it's actually loaded with a range of material inside and then sent into space, into the atmosphere. And it overlooks, you're basically in direct dialogue with the entire city of London, the corporate stronghold that has its own kind of governance and system and structure. And what you were doing is kind of intervening in that culture of being surveilled. It was like you were making aware those who were surveilling you that you were also surveilling them, that you were conscious and physically present and aware of that. And what you kind of created was this almost air-based-like environment where it became kind of a hub, really, for people to kind of come and be made aware of this context, but also that material and that data came and was pulled together. What particularly was interesting to me was that visual material became abstracted in the kind of animations and things that you did inside of it. And I'm wondering what your relationship is actually to embodiment and because you rarely see in these images, these aerial view images, people, bodies, they always look like pixels. And that to me is a very curious thing about this idea of an aesthetic in this work. But you can answer that from any tale.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's something really fascinating about embodiment within satellite systems, not least because until this year, in fact, or maybe like November last year, the highest commercially available satellite imagery was at a resolution of 50 centimeters. That basically means that a pixel you see in it, the size of a pixel is 50 centimeters, half a meter on the ground. That's one pixel in most of the high-res satellite images you will have seen. Military has better than that. But the stuff that we can see, it's 50 centimeters, and that's like roughly the size of a human from above, which basically means we were for years the limitation of high-res satellite imagery was almost precisely at the limitations of the body itself. To what extent that is deliberate remains kind of unclear, and as I say, there's going to be systems that are more capable of that. But the body within satellite, and actually Lawrence and the forensic architecture people can say a lot about the affordances of kind of space-based image viewing for things like human rights. For me, this was obviously a lot closer. The camera was only at kind of a few hundred feet in these. And yeah, as you said, it was, first of all, I was going to use it to produce cool aerial imagery, because despite all of my fears and complex feelings about it, as I said, it often looks great. But almost immediately, I felt deeply discomforted about that. That this was supposed to be a project about like reclaiming the position of surveillance, and this was the camera on this was made open access. It could be directed. All of the footage was kind of open release and all this kind of stuff. But it didn't help. It didn't help me psychically deal with the fact that I was still surveilling. That as soon, like whoever puts the camera up in the sky, like you are putting yourself at the top of that power relationship. out of which like no good can come, I felt. And actually so one of the things that I did do was make these kind of abstract images where I was taking footage from the camera and putting it through essentially a kaleidoscope filter that kind of removed all information content from it, but made something that remained kind of beautiful and interesting to look at. But to be honest, that was like a quick fix, like a hack to this like tainted imagery that I'd produced. And it produced a real reaction in me of like not wanting to make any representational imagery of that kind, because it just felt like from this kind of position that was completely untenable.
I mean, the culture of being surveilled is one that I think, especially in the last couple of years, particularly in the last year, what with Edward Snowden's image and persona becoming popularized, but also things like Citizen4 being made and winning an Oscar, for example, we've become much more aware of the visual vocabulary around cultures of surveillance, and we actually, many people now do know, for example, what a data center looks like, or know what the NSA stands for, and it features in popular culture increasingly. I'm interested about your particular position or relationship to that as an individual, what you feel as individuals our role is in terms of understanding that or speaking to that culture of surveillance. Because what struck me with this project was that you were also potentially, it was a serious project, potentially also poking fun of the fact that we were all being watched and you're watching back, and as we know, London is the most surveilled city in the world. What's your position in relation to that?
I think what we're doing, or what's happening in this project and some of the other ones, is feeling like I'm hitting that limit of like what is possible or valid or like appropriate in terms of the discourse of making visible, in terms of that conversation about trying to like really nail down an explanation of something. I think there's something that's really interesting that's happened in, well, so first of all, there's something interesting in the fact that like none of the Snowden revelations have worked, right, from the position of the surveilled, from the position of those of us who maybe think this isn't a great idea. Like, it hasn't worked. It's all legitimized it, in fact. It's had completely the opposite effect. And what you suddenly start noticing is that actually the two opposing sides on this debate have exactly the same worldview, right? Like, WikiLeaks and the NSA believe the same thing, which is that there is like some magical truth at the heart of the world that if only it could be brought to light, everything would just be wonderfully better, right? It's a conspiracy theory view of the world, but like we're all kind of conspiracy theorists in that we prefer simple, nice, neat, tied up stories about the world to make sense of them. And it's starting to occur to me that the fallacy at the heart of that belief system is the same as the kind of fallacy that maybe we started talking about at the beginning of this, that I had, this attempt to understand the internet as a material object in the way that we've always thought about things, or is just like a limitation in our capacity to conceptualize the world that we're going to need to be better at, that we have to become comfortable with forms of uncertainty that, like all the other types, have always existed, but have not been made radically visible to us in the way that the network makes these things visible to us. That we can no longer be comfy with those kind of easy stories about things. And likewise, we've always known we shouldn't be, right? We've always known that's a bad track to take, but it's an easy one. And it's often always been the one that's only possible to us. But increasingly for me, what the network reveals is the deep kind of inconsistencies within our understanding of the world that will not be resolved by trying to like hammer those into some kind of false consistency, but by taking on a kind of radically different, decentered and networked way of seeing the world.
Well, I'm sorry to say that I think we're out of time now for this session, but we can take some questions, because I do think that you'll probably have opened up lots of things for debate. So if there's any questions, you've got time for just a couple of questions. We've got one at the back there. We've got Mike there. Oh, just there.
Hello. So one of my favorite quotes, and I'll paraphrase this, but it says, what's great and human is that we are the bridge and not the end. I'm curious to understand how you feel about that quote.
It's a good one. We're not the end. If it means it kind of systemically and technologically, then it would explain what Troy said very nicely earlier about this kind of engineering-centric view of the world. I'm not sure what we need to build is a better bridge, but it's to reconceptualize what that end is. That's what I think.
Thank you. Anything else? Anyone else? I'm in the front row here. If there's a mic. Thanks, Sean.
I was wondering about the times that you've mentioned putting the work online. There was the blogging with Tumblr and then other blogging platforms, the way that there was the Dronestagram, but also Twitter and Facebook, and or maybe not, but in these other ones, whether you have any kind of engagement with the nuances of different social media, like what the kind of Tumblr population does as opposed to the Reddit population, and what Instagram does as opposed to like the Twitter, and how far that informs like the development of your work.
Yeah, I mean, these are all like fascinatingly diverse cultures, essentially. And as you say, the culture of Tumblr, which is, you know, a nation of X million individuals, is a fascinating kind of thing within its own right. And each one of those systems, so both their culture and their technological platform, are kind of codependent, co-producing, and yeah, they all respond in very different ways. I think the new aesthetic is something that owes a lot to the platform and culture of Tumblr. I think Dronestagram, like, while it goes out across different platforms, find its very natural home within Instagram because of the style of presentation that the platform affords it. But I think for me, in terms of how I engage with it, in terms of making work, it's, okay, here's this new thing, how do I ram what I want to say through it, essentially? And finding the form of that platform that allows you to have that conversation. So the first thing that Twitter did, when I first got on Twitter in 2007, was I wrote a bot that read the whole of Ulysses to Twitter, line by line, over about 18 months. Because I was just like, what is this thing for? Like, and how do we figure out what we can use it for? And you know, these are all the projects that have stuck, essentially. There's like a lot of failed, broken bits of the, you know, if you come across strange web pages I found on my server, that's something that I built that sort of half works because it's just trying to see if it works in this way. So yeah, you respond to those technologies kind of as they come along, but the main thing to do is like just ram art into them until it, you know, until it assumes the form that it, you know, that suits the culture and the platform together.
Last question, Tori, then wrap it up.
Can I just make an addendum to that? I'm on the board of the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, and when a couple of Twitter users picked up on their drone data and started tweeting it out, they were furious because those were the users who were developing the network, who were having the real impact. To your point, these are forms which you ram art down until they work. It just turns out that the blog form for the Bureau was not the right one, it was actually Twitter.
Well, that's all we have time for just now. I'm really, I think we've only just skimmed the surface of something, something very big, and I hope that the rest of the conversations over the course of the days will pick up on these different threads of ideas and conversation, but also that you will follow both me, maybe me, but more importantly James. Where's your where's your Twitter hashtag? Put it up.
I put both of us on.
You'll follow me. That you'll follow James on Twitter and continue the conversation there. Thank you very much.
And thank you to Omar.
Thank you, Omar, very much indeed for all of that. Oh, thank you.